Everyone laughed when the Chinese billionaire mocked the black waiter, until he or her responded in Chinese. "Look at that monkey serving our table," said Li Wei in Mandarin, pointing at the waiter as if he were a decorative object. "I bet he doesn't even know how to hold chopsticks properly. People like him should be cleaning toilets, not serving civilized people like us." The laughter from the table echoed through the Jade Palace, Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. The 5 American businessmen laughed nervously, not understanding a word, but desperate to impress the woman who controlled a $60 billion empire. David Thompson continued pouring wine, his face impassive, as if he hadn't heard a single poisonous syllable. At 32, he had learned to swallow humiliations like this every day for the past 8 months. But this time, something different shone in his eyes, a dangerous calm that only exists in those who have weathered much worse storms. Li Wei, heiress to Wei Industries and one of the richest women in Asia, had arrived in New York to close technology import deals. Her arrogance was legendary even among billionaires. She treated Americans like ignorant children and black people as if they were an inferior species. "That one probably didn't even finish high school," she continued in Mandarin, savoring every cruel word. "In the United States, he thinks giving jobs to people like that is progress. What a joke." David understood every word, every racial slur, every contemptuous comment, every display of cultural superiority. But what Li Wei didn't know was that this monkey spoke fluent Mandarin, had a master's degree in Asian studies from Harvard, and had spent 5 years working as a cultural attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. 8 months earlier, David was Dr. David Thompson, one of America's leading experts on Sino-U.S. relations. Her life fell apart when she was falsely accused of leaking diplomatic information to China. Even though she was completely exonerated, the doors to the academic world closed. No one wanted to hire someone who had been investigated by the FBI, even if unjustly. "More wine," Li Wei ordered in broken English, deliberately mispronouncing words, as if speaking correctly would lower her to the level of the natives. David served in silence, noticing how she made a point of not looking him in the eye. After all, why acknowledge the humanity of an inferior? While everyone mocked him openly, David maintained the unsettling serenity of someone who holds a secret too powerful to be revealed before the right time. Li Wei was about to discover that underestimating someone based solely on the color of their skin can be the biggest mistake a person makes in their life. If you're enjoying this story of revenge and justice, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple night of humiliation would turn into the most expensive lesson a billionaire ever paid. Li Wei was having fun like a cruel child torturing a defenseless animal. Over the next 40 minutes, she turned dinner into a spectacle of racial humiliation that made even the American businessmen shift uncomfortably in her chairs. "This monkey must think he'll get a nice tip tonight," she said in Mandarin, pretending to adjust her napkin as David served the appetizer. "In the United States, they think he thinks giving money solves the problem of racial inferiority. How naive." The 5 businessmen laughed nervously, not understanding a word, but sensing that something cruel was happening. Robert Hayes, CEO of the largest electronics importer on the East Coast, tried to change the subject several times, but Li Wei always returned his focus to David. "You Americans are pathetic," she continued, now alternating between Mandarin and English. "You think putting these people in real jobs is social progress. But just look at him. He can't even hold a tray without shaking." David wasn't shaking with fear. Her hands were shaking with contained rage, remembering how, just 9 months earlier, he had dined with the Chinese ambassador herself in Washington, discussing billion-dollar trade deals. At the time, Li Wei was probably at some socialite party in Shanghai, spending the money he inherited from his father. David's fall had been brutal and calculated. Dr. David Thompson was considered the foremost American expert on Chinese business culture. Her doctoral thesis on diplomatic protocols in Sino-American relations was required reading at universities around the world. At the age of 30, he was already coordinating negotiations between governments and speaking Mandarin with native fluency. Everything fell apart when Marcus Sterling, a jealous colleague at the State Department, planted false documents suggesting that David was passing confidential information to Beijing. The FBI investigation lasted 7 months. 7 months of public humiliation, sensational headlines, and friends turning their backs. When he was completely exonerated, the evidence against him revealed as obvious forgeries. It was too late. No one in the diplomatic world wanted to hire someone who had been investigated for espionage, even if unjustly. Marcus Sterling, naturally, received the promotion that should have been David's. "Bring the bill," Li Wei ordered in broken English, as if speaking correctly would be demeaning. "And tell that little girl I'm Li Wei from Wei Industries. Maybe he's heard of my family on television." David almost choked. Li Wei from Wei Industries. The same Li Wei with whom he had exchanged formal emails for 3 years, coordinating visits by trade delegations. The same Li Wei who had publicly praised his work at the embassy, calling him the American who really understands our culture. Of course, she didn't recognize him. At the time, David wore $3,000 suits and frequented the same social circles as her. her. Now in his black waiter's uniform, he was invisible to someone like Li Wei, just another black worker serving her table. You know what the problem with Americans is, she said in Mandarin, savoring every poisonous word. You think democracy means everyone is equal, but the reality is that there are superior people and inferior people. It's the natural order of things. Her pointing directly at David. That one, for example, probably has children from 3 different fathers and lives in an apartment with 10 other people. That's how these people live, in ignorance and promiscuity. Robert Hayes was visibly uncomfortable. Li Wei, maybe we should focus on the contracts. No, she interrupted, waving her jeweled hand. Let me finish my American sociology lesson. You need to understand who you're dealing with when you do business with us. David continued serving, his face impassive, but internally every word was catalogued and filed away. Li Wei didn't know she was digging her own grave with every insult, every display of prejudice, every show of cultural arrogance. The worst came when she asked David to come closer to the table. You, she said in English, pointing as if she were calling a dog. What is your name? David, ma'am. David, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue as if it were something unpleasant. Have you ever heard of China, David? Do you know where it is on the map? The businessmen were petrified. The situation had gone beyond all limits of acceptable embarrassment, even for men accustomed to the ruthless world of international business. Yes, ma'am, David replied calmly. Li Wei laughed loudly. How cute. He knows where China is. She turned to the table, speaking in Mandarin. I would bet my fortune that this monkey has never set foot outside New York in his life. It was at that moment that something changed in the air of the restaurant. David stopped writing down the order and looked directly into Li Wei's eyes for the first time that night. It wasn't submission, it wasn't fear. It was something much more dangerous. It was recognition. Each new humiliation only fueled a silent strength growing inside his, a cold determination being forged by the very injustice they were trying to impose on him. What that arrogant billionaire couldn't see was that every racial slur was writing his own sentence of defeat, word by word, humiliation by humiliation. During the break between dinner and dessert, while Li Wei continued to spew insults in Mandarin to entertain the American businessmen, David headed to the employee bathroom with a calmness that contrasted with the storm brewing inside him. That monkey probably can't even count to 100, she said in Mandarin when David was out of sight. I bet the whole family lives on food stamps and government assistance. That's how that inferior race survives in the United States. Robert Hayes was visibly nauseated. Li Wei, this is going too far. Too far, she laughed. You Americans are so sensitive. In China, we know how to deal with every type of person in his proper place. That's the difference between a civilization that's thousands of years old and a country that's only 200 years old. Meanwhile, in the staff bathroom, David took out his cell phone and began typing a message that would change everything. The recipient was Dr. James Chun, his former mentor at Columbia University, now director of the Center for Asian Studies and one of the most respected Chinese Americans in New York. James, I need an urgent favor. I'm at the Jade Palace in Manhattan, and I just witnessed something that may be of interest to the Chinese diplomatic community. Li Wei of Wei Industries is here, making extreme racist comments, thinking that no one understands Mandarin. I have everything recorded. Can we meet tomorrow? The reply came in less than 2 minutes. My God, David, where have you been all this time? Yes, let's meet. Li Wei is under internal investigation in China for corruption and unethical behavior abroad. Her comments could be exactly what we need. David smiled for the first time in months. Dr. Chen didn't know he was working as a waiter. In the message, David had identified himself only as a witness to the events. His mentor still knew him as the brilliant diplomat he had been. When David returned to the hall, Li Wei had escalated her humiliation campaign to a level that made even the most callous businessmen shift uncomfortably. She was speaking in deliberately broken English, imitating accents she considered inferior. You know how to clear a table properly, she said to David in childish English, as if she were talking to a child. Or do you only know how to carry plates like a trained monkey? The businessmen fell into a deathly silence. Even for men accustomed to the cruelty of international business, this was unacceptable. But none of them had the courage to confront a woman who controlled billion-dollar contracts. I can clear the table perfectly, ma'am, David replied with a calmness that contrasted with the violence of her words. How cute, she laughed loudly. He can speak properly. Maybe he's not as dumb as he looks. She turned to the businessmen. Did you see that? When you treat these people firmly, they learn how to behave. That was when Li Wei made the mistake that would seal his fate. She took out her cell phone and began recording a video, narrating in Mandarin. I'm here at the most expensive restaurant in Manhattan, showing how Americans educate their black workers. Look how quiet he is when I speak with authority. David continued cleaning the table, but internally every second of that video was being cataloged as evidence. Li Wei was documenting his own downfall, creating video evidence of his racial and cultural arrogance. In China, she continued recording, we know that each race has its natural function. Black Americans are good for manual labor, but never for leadership or intelligence. It's basic biology. Robert Hayes stood up abruptly. "Excuse me, I need to make a call." He left the table clearly upset, followed by two other businessmen. The situation had crossed all boundaries of tolerance. Li Wei interpreted their departure as tacit approval. "Did you see how it works? When you establish a clear hierarchy, even Americans understand." She continued recording. "This waiter here is a perfect example of how to maintain social order. He knows exactly where his place is in the world." David finished clearing the table and stood respectfully to the side, waiting for instructions. But his eyes no longer showed submission. There was something different there, a growing intensity that Li Wei was too busy with her performance to notice. Over the next 20 minutes, she created a complete file of evidence against herself. Comments about Chinese racial superiority, insults directed specifically at black Americans, theories about a natural hierarchy between races, and clear demonstrations of discrimination based on skin color. "You know what the problem with America is," she said in Mandarin, still recording. "You give too many rights to people who should just serve. That waiter over there, for example, probably thinks he deserves the same salary as educated people like us." That's when David made a decision that would change not only her life, but potentially the business relations between two world powers. He discreetly took out his own cell phone and began recording her recording, a video within a video, capturing not only the words, but the expression of cruel pleasure on her face as she humiliated another human being. "People like you," Li Wei continued in Mandarin, pointing directly at David, "should be grateful for having any job at all. When I was a student in China, we had a saying, a dog that barks doesn't bite, but a dog that doesn't bark doesn't think either." David kept his expression neutral, but internally he was compiling not just evidence, but strategies. Every insult would be documented, every display of prejudice would be catalogued, every moment of arrogance would be preserved for the reckoning that would come. What Li Wei couldn't see was that with every poisonous word, she was not only digging her own professional grave, but potentially creating an international diplomatic incident. David knew exactly which Chinese and American organizations would be interested in that material. "Tomorrow I'm going to post this on my social media," she said in Mandarin, ending the recording. "My followers in China will find it hilarious to see how Americans allow this kind of people to work in decent places." David smiled subtly. Li Wei was right about one thing. Someone would definitely find those videos very interesting, but it wouldn't be his followers on social media. As she put her phone away, satisfied with her cruel performance, David continued serving with the patience of a man who knows that true justice sometimes needs to be prepared slowly, like a fine dish being carefully seasoned before being served. What that arrogant billionaire couldn't imagine was that every second of humiliation she had inflicted was being turned into ammunition for a battle she didn't even know had begun. And when the war finally erupted, she would discover that she had chosen the wrong opponent at the wrong time, using the wrong weapons against someone who played at a completely different level than her. Li Wei was finishing her third glass of expensive champagne when she decided to take her cruel performance to the grand finale. The few American businessmen remaining at the table were visibly uncomfortable, but she interpreted this as admiration for her cultural superiority. "You know what?" she said in Mandarin, looking directly at David. "I'm going to teach this monkey a lesson about social hierarchy." She turned to David and said in broken English, You know how to dance like a monkey? I want to see funny show." It was at that moment that David Thompson made the decision that would change everything. He stopped clearing the table, straightened his shoulders, and for the first time that evening smiled, a smile that made Robert Hayes choke on his wine. "Ms. Li Wei," David said in perfect Mandarin, her pronunciation more elegant than his, "I believe you are confusing this establishment with a zoo." The silence that fell over the restaurant was deafening. Li Wei was completely paralyzed, his face turning every shade of white imaginable. The words in fluent Mandarin coming out of David's mouth were like lightning striking her in the chest. What did you say?" she stammered in English, her arrogance evaporating like water in the desert. David continued in classical Mandarin, her fluency demonstrating years of academic study. "I said it's interesting how some people confuse money with education, birth with character, and social status with human value." The American businessmen were speechless. Robert Hayes, who had worked with Chinese interpreters for years, immediately recognized that David not only spoke Mandarin, he had mastered dialects and nuances that only someone with a higher education could achieve. You speak Chinese," Li Wei murmured, her voice almost inaudible. "Classical Mandarin, modern Mandarin, Cantonese, and 3 regional dialects," David replied calmly, now switching between English and Mandarin, in addition to English, French, and a little Japanese. "But I imagine you've already noticed that from the last 90 minutes of conversation." The realization hit Li Wei like a punch in the stomach. 90 minutes. He had understood every word, every racial slur, every display of prejudice, every cruel comment she had hurled at him in Mandarin. "That's impossible," she stammered, trying to regain control. "You're just a black American waiter." I am a waiter, David confirmed, his voice firm but unaggressive. But I am also Dr. David Thompson, with a PhD in Asian Studies from Harvard University, specializing in Sino-American relations and Chinese business culture. He paused, letting the information sink in. I worked for 5 years as a cultural attaché at the American Embassy in Beijing. I coordinated trade delegations between our countries and published 17 academic articles on Chinese diplomatic protocol. Robert Hayes nearly knocked over his chair as he stood up. My God, you're David Thompson. I read her thesis on Chinese investment in American infrastructure. You disappeared from the diplomatic world a year ago. Li Wei felt the world spinning around her. But why are you working as a waiter? Because sometimes life teaches us lessons in humility, David replied. I was falsely accused of espionage by the FBI. By the time I was completely cleared, the doors to the diplomatic world had already closed. He looked her straight in the eye. So I took this job to survive. And for 8 months, people like you humiliated me daily, making comments in Mandarin, thinking I didn't understand. David took his cell phone out of his pocket. Comments about my race, my intelligence, theories about the natural hierarchy between peoples, and entire philosophies about superiority based on nationality and skin color. Li Wei realized where this was going, and his face turned green. You wouldn't dare. Record everything. David smiled. Of course I did. Every insult, every display of prejudice, every moment of racial arrogance, including the video you made of yourself explaining your theories about Chinese superiority and black inferiority. Li Wei's humiliation was complete, but David wasn't finished. In fact, Ms. Li Wei, I believe we know each other professionally. I coordinated 3 conferences on Sino-US investment in which your company participated. He paused dramatically. She was present at 2 video conferences with me in 2022. Of course, I was wearing a suit and speaking as an equal with ambassadors. It's understandable that you didn't recognize me serving at his table. Li Wei tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. Not only had she been completely exposed, but she discovered that the man who had spent the evening humiliating her was someone who had negotiated diplomatic agreements that affected her own company. David continued, now with the natural authority of someone accustomed to commanding meeting rooms. You said that people like me don't understand international politics. But I spent 3 years negotiating trade agreements between the United States and China, including some contracts that directly benefited Wei Industries. The American businessmen were in a state of total shock. They finally understood that they had spent the entire evening passively watching one of the foremost American authorities on Chinese culture being racially humiliated by an ignorant billionaire. You have also developed several theories about intellectual capacity based on race, David said, still in a calm but devastating tone. It would be interesting to know what his Chinese Communist Party would think about a Chinese businesswoman promoting theories of racial superiority on American soil. Li Wei finally found her voice. You can't. It would ruin her reputation, his international contracts, her position in the family business. David finished gently. I imagine so, especially considering that China has very strict policies about citizens who embarrass the country abroad. Robert Hayes, still processing the revelation, muttered, Li Wei, you humiliated one of America's leading experts on your own culture. David took out his cell phone and showed the screen to Li Wei. I've already sent a copy of the recordings to Dr. James Chun, director of Columbia Center for Asian Studies. He was, let's just say, very interested in the content. The screen showed a message from Dr. Chen. David, this is explosive. The Chinese consulate needs to see this immediately. Li Wei may have created an international diplomatic incident. I also sent it to the Chinese Business Association in the United States, David continued calmly. They have a very strict code of ethics regarding member behavior on foreign soil. Li Wei was sweating cold. Her company depended on international contracts, and any racial scandal could cost billions in canceled deals. Worse still, the Chinese government did not tolerate citizens who created diplomatic problems. Please, she whispered, all her arrogance evaporated. I didn't know who he was. And that would justify his treatment if you were really just a waiter? David asked, his question echoing through the silent restaurant. Does human dignity depend on a diploma or a bank account? The restaurant manager, who had been watching from a distance, approached the table. Mr. Thompson, he said with renewed respect, I didn't know his background. From now on, our policy will be very different. David nodded. Thank you. But this isn't about me. It's about how we treat people we consider different, when we think we can act without consequences. Li Wei tried one last time. Dr. Thompson, maybe we can come to an agreement. An agreement? David smiled sadly. Ms. Li Wei, for 8 months, dozens of people like you humiliated him, thinking he was just another ignorant worker. Every insult was cataloged, every display of prejudice documented. He put his phone away. The only thing I want now is for her to leave here knowing that she has been intellectually destroyed by a black American man he considered trash. And may that lesson stay with her for the rest of her life. Li Wei stood up from the table with trembling legs, her arrogance replaced by pure panic. She knew that when those videos reached the right circles in China and the United States, her career would be over. David remained calm and dignified until the end, proving that true strength does not come from money or status, but from character. As Li Wei left the restaurant carrying the weight of the greatest humiliation of her life, one question hung in the air. Was it possible for someone so consumed by prejudice to learn anything? Or do some people simply need to learn the hard way that arrogance always comes at a price? 3 months after that night at Jade Palace, both of their lives had changed completely, but in opposite ways. Li Wei woke up once again to devastating headlines. Billionaire heiress loses $800 million in contracts after racist videos, read the Wall Street Journal. The Chinese consulate had issued an official statement distancing itself from her remarks, and Wei Industries lost 70% of his U.S. contracts in just 2 weeks. The family has decided that you need some time to reflect, his uncle said in Mandarin during a tense video conference. His executive privileges are suspended indefinitely. The woman who had arrived in New York as a queen was returning home as a corporate pariah. Meanwhile, David Thompson had become an international phenomenon. The video of the confrontation went viral with over 50 million views, turning him into a global symbol of dignity in the face of prejudice. Universities in 3 countries invited him to speak, and the State Department offered her old position back, with a promotion and a 60% raise. It wasn't about revenge, David explained in an interview with CNN. It was about showing that human dignity is priceless, and that education can be found where we least expect it. He agreed to return to diplomacy, but kept 1 day a week at Jade Palace, now as a senior advisor and minority partner. The restaurant became a pilgrimage site for human rights activists. Customers from around the world came to see the place where a waiter had taught a billionaire a lesson in humility. The movement led to the creation of the David Thompson Protocol, zero-tolerance policies against discrimination in commercial establishments. Li Wei made a final public appeal, recording a video apology that only made her situation worse. "I apologize for my unfortunate comments," she said in halting English. But social media was merciless. "Not unfortunate, racist. He's only apologizing because he got caught. Privilege doesn't buy character." 6 months later, during a conference on corporate diversity, David ran into Robert Hayes, one of the businessmen who had witnessed everything. "David, you taught us that underestimating people is the biggest business mistake there is," Hayes said, shaking his hand with genuine respect. Li Wei, meanwhile, lived in seclusion in Shanghai, his arrogance replaced by social isolation. Friends avoided her, contracts were cancelled, and his reputation never recovered. The most expensive lesson a billionaire has ever paid: money can't buy dignity, and prejudice always takes its toll. If this story about dignity, overcoming adversity, and justice touched his heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. How would he react if he witnessed a situation like this? Together, we can spread the message that respect is not a privilege, it is a basic right of every human being.